Jasmine Crockett discovered that U.S. federal judges were secretly editing court rulings based on scripts written by political lobbyists. Her revelation shook the justice system to its core, triggering chaos in courtrooms across the country. She was hacked, discredited, and nearly stripped of her license for speaking out. But what exactly did Jasmine expose that made those in power desperate to silence her? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under gray skies and beneath the looming architecture of the Chicago Federal Courthouse, a storm was gathering, one not of weather, but of power. Jasmine Crockett, known across the country as a relentless civil rights attorney and defender of the voiceless, stepped out of a black SUV flanked by silence and a single, determined purpose. She wasn't scheduled to speak that morning. She was scheduled to be judged. Accused of defying a federal court order, she was being dragged into a legal firestorm for intervening in the deportation of dozens of Venezuelan asylum seekers. But to Jasmine, they weren't cases or delays. They were people, terrified, begging for a chance. Inside, the atmosphere thickened with tension. Cameras tracked her every step. Politicians whispered behind closed doors. And on the judge's bench, Richard Alden waited, the symbol of a system many believed had forgotten how to feel. Alden wasn't just a judge. He was a machine in a robe, cold, precise, a man with a long history of rulings that always seemed to favor structure over soul. He had once ruled against a pregnant refugee seeking shelter during a Category 4 hurricane because protocol hadn't been followed. His presence in this case wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Jasmine, on the other hand, had become a lightning rod, praised by some as the conscience of American law, vilified by others as a threat to institutional order. And now the institution was ready to strike back. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, aides, even retired judges sat stiffly, waiting for the first blow to land. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, alone at the defense table, wearing the calm, not of resignation, but of readiness. Today, she wasn't just on trial. Justice itself was. Under the unforgiving glow of courtroom lights, Judge Richard Alden leaned forward, his voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. "Ms. Crockett," he began, eyes narrowing with the weight of institutional authority, "you knowingly exceeded the boundaries of your legal role. This court issued a direct federal order, and you chose to disregard it." His tone was cold, calculated. Each word delivered like a scalpel, meant not only to accuse but to humiliate. You interfered with a deportation proceeding that was fully sanctioned under federal law. You had no jurisdiction, no standing, no permission. Around the courtroom, pens stopped moving. Breath was held. And yet, you took it upon yourself to obstruct enforcement officers and delay a flight for nearly 22 hours. He continued, his voice rising slightly. You acted as if your personal conviction could override the rule of law. Jasmine stood motionless, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. But inside she could feel it. The system had already written her guilt in ink. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, like the seconds before a thunderclap. Judge Alden had just finished painting her as reckless, defiant, and dangerous. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to plead, to fold, or to apologize. She took a slow breath, her hands resting calmly on the edge of the table, her voice low, but with the precision of a blade. You accuse me of disrespecting this court, she began, locking eyes with Alden. But I'm not the one disrespecting justice. The room went still again, as if everyone could feel what was about to come. Let's be honest. This isn't just about me delaying a deportation. This is about what happens when someone dares to question the machinery, when someone refuses to let a process built on silence run uninterrupted. Her voice rose, not in volume but in force. You call it defiance, I call it decency. Because when people are being loaded onto planes without legal representation, without a hearing, without even someone to say their name in court, what exactly are we defending here? She stepped fully forward now, into the spotlight that had been built to burn her down, and turned it into a pulpit. Your Honor, she said with chilling clarity, we both know this courtroom doesn't exist in a vacuum. We both know the rulings that come from this bench echo beyond these walls, and we both know certain voices are louder in your chambers than others. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. One reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. There are patterns, she continued, eyes never leaving Alden. Petitions submitted, denied, delayed, always favoring one side. Always in sync with briefs from outside groups with political goals and donor lists longer than their moral codes. The judge shifted in his seat. So no, Jasmine said, voice steady and full of fire. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to say what no one else will say in this room. And then she delivered the line that would go viral before the session even ended. The law cannot be a shield for the man sitting on the throne. It must be a weapon for the ones at his feet. The room didn't react immediately. It froze. Every breath held. Every thought stopped. Alden sat motionless, caught between fury and calculation. The silence was deafening, because it wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. A courtroom designed to shame her had become a witness stand for the system itself. Journalists stared wide-eyed. One assistant dropped a folder without realizing it. And far in the back, someone, just one person, started to quietly clap before stopping, remembering where they were. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just stood there unflinching, as if daring the entire system to say she was wrong. And in that moment, no one could. The tension hadn't just returned, it had thickened, tightening like a noose around every person seated in courtroom 7B. Jasmine Crockett stood in the eye of that storm, not as a victim of it, but as the one steering it. Her words still echoed in the air, but this time, she didn't let the silence settle. No delay, no hesitation. She reached into her briefcase. The metallic snap of the latch echoed like a warning shot. Then came the envelope, manila, thin, but more dangerous than a loaded weapon. A single blue sticker on the flap read, "Confidential, verified." She held it up with calm precision, as if she was holding the verdict itself. All around her, the room seemed to hold its breath. The judge's expression didn't change, but his posture did. He leaned forward, alert, defensive. Jasmine turned, her tone steady, voice cold as steel. "Since I've been accused of undermining this court," she began, "let's talk about what's really been happening behind those chambers." She walked forward and placed the envelope on the clerk's desk, her movements exact and unshakable. Inside is a sworn affidavit, signed, dated, filed by Cameron West. She paused just long enough to let the name register. "He worked in your office, Judge Alden, for 4 years. The judge blinked once. Jasmine didn't. "He saw everything," she continued. "He watched legal briefs from a so-called nonprofit, Justice Horizon, land on your desk before they were even filed in court. He saw you review them, edit them, send back comments." The gallery shifted. Shocked murmurs swept across the rows like rising smoke. He didn't want to believe what he saw, but then he noticed something worse. Your rulings started using the exact language from those secret drafts, word for word. Alden opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jasmine didn't give him the chance. "This isn't speculation," she said, her voice rising with each word. "This is evidence, emails, drafts, internal memos, and your own initials, signed on edits that were never supposed to exist." Her hand hovered above the envelope. "This isn't about politics. It's not even about me. It's about you, a federal judge secretly coordinating with outside interests to steer the outcome of legal decisions while pretending the bench is neutral." She took a step closer to the bench. "And I'm not going to sit here and be lectured about respecting the law by someone who broke it before I even walked into this courtroom." The air cracked with tension. For a moment, it seemed even the walls were listening. Alden's voice came out colder now, but thinner. "This is a disgraceful ambush, Miss Crockett," he said. "You're not here to practice law. You're staging a circus." But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice didn't tremble. She looked him dead in the eye. "No, Your Honor," she fired back. "This isn't a circus. It's a spotlight, and I'm pointing it right where it belongs." The clerk didn't dare touch the envelope. Reporters were already typing, whispering, capturing every word. The name Cameron West had landed like a bomb. Jasmine pressed forward. "He left your office in silence. No press, no lawsuit. Just the truth, and this affidavit." He tried to raise it quietly. He was ignored, pushed out. So now I'm here to make sure his voice is finally heard. She faced the gallery again, louder now. Because when people like Cameron stay silent, this system rots. But when they speak, it panics. Alden's face had turned hard as stone, but his silence betrayed the pressure. Jasmine turned back to him. Her voice dropped, quieter but sharper. You abused this bench. You turned your robe into armor for political favors. And the people paying the price weren't in chambers with you. They were in holding cells, in airport terminals. On deportation lists, another beat. Then she added, "Don't worry, Your Honor. This time there's a paper trail." Reporters were out of their seats. Phones lit up like wildfire. One assistant U.S. Marshal shifted his stance. The moment had turned. Jasmine stood taller now, not just as a defense attorney, but as a witness, a messenger, a spark. "File this into the record," she told the clerk, "and prepare for an investigation, because the courtroom isn't yours anymore. It belongs to the truth now." Jasmine's final words still echoed in the charged silence, but she said nothing more. She didn't need to. The courtroom was no longer under his control. It was under scrutiny, and for a man who'd ruled with absolute authority for decades, that realization landed like a punch to the ribs. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Alden reached for his gavel. But this time, there was no conviction in the motion, just damage control. He cleared his throat, voice brittle. "This court will enter immediate recess pending review of the submitted document." No elaboration, no dismissal instructions. He stood quickly, almost too quickly, his black robe sweeping behind him like a curtain closing on a collapsing act. Then he turned and walked through the side exit, head high but spine tight, like a man carrying the weight of exposure on his shoulders. He didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't. And in that instant, everything changed. The room detonated, not with violence, but with voices. The gallery broke into a chorus of shock, disbelief, and barely controlled chaos. Reporters scrambled to their feet, ripping notepads from bags, thrusting recorders into the air. The clack of keyboards sounded like a machine gun. Phones were already dialing into newsroom switchboards. "We need a satellite truck now. Judge Alden just recessed without rebuttal." "Confirmed affidavit. Confidential seal. Source, former court staffer." She dropped a bomb in there, live. The words spread faster than wildfire, spilling out of the courtroom and into the veins of the media machine waiting outside. Jasmine remained still. She didn't flinch. She didn't move to leave. Her hands stayed at her sides and her expression didn't change. Because she knew this moment wasn't about noise. It was about the shift beneath the noise. The kind of shift you can't see but feel in your bones. A courtroom built to control people had just lost control of itself. And the ones used to pulling the strings were now realizing the strings had snapped. In the hallway, security tightened. Marshals exchanged looks, unsure whether to intervene or stand back. The court clerk, visibly shaken, clutched the manila envelope like it contained something radioactive. A legal assistant near the doors whispered. She flipped the courtroom. "I've never seen anything like that. Not ever." Inside the media pen just outside the building, reporters were shouting into cameras. "Breaking news out of Chicago, civil rights attorney Jasmine Crockett has just forced the abrupt suspension of a federal hearing after submitting a whistleblower affidavit implicating Judge Richard Alden in potential judicial misconduct." Microphones swarmed toward the exit like vultures scenting blood. Jasmine stepped out a moment later, not flanked by a team of spin doctors or armed security, just Rebecca, her co-counsel, and the silence of a woman who had just faced down the machine and made it stutter. The second her foot touched the top step, the crowd surged. "Ms. Crockett, do you have evidence the judge violated ethics protocol? Is the affidavit authentic? Did Alden tamper with rulings? Are you accusing the federal judiciary of corruption?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush to the cameras. Instead, she said one thing, measured, firm, unforgettable. "I'm not accusing anyone. I submitted proof. There's a difference." The crowd erupted again, but Jasmine was already moving down the stairs. Within 15 minutes, her name had hit the news cycle. Headlines screamed across the screens. Federal judge abruptly recesses after explosive filing. Whistleblower accuses Alden of back-channel brief shaping. Jasmine Crockett drops legal bombshell in live hearing. It was inescapable. On every screen, every feed. Legal analysts were cutting into their segments. Commentators scrambled to reframe the narrative. Alden's decades-long record was being torn open like a vault. Cable news flashed side-by-side photos of Jasmine in court and Alden stepping off the bench. One anchor said it plainly. This isn't just a dramatic moment in one courtroom. This could unravel trust in judicial neutrality across the country. But for Jasmine, the media frenzy was noise on the edge of a much deeper war. Because while cameras captured the fallout, she understood what she just touched. A system that doesn't just protect itself, it retaliates. She knew what came next. Calls to discredit, leaks to distract. Legal threats designed not to win, but to exhaust. Yet she also knew this. There was no walking backward through that door. Not after what she'd just done. Not after showing the public that even a courtroom, sacred, solemn, untouchable, could be infected by silent deals behind closed doors. And somewhere, Judge Alden sat alone in his private chambers, staring at the envelope now being copied by court staff under federal oversight. For the first time in his career, he wasn't issuing orders. He was waiting for one. And Jasmine? She wasn't waiting for anything. She was already preparing for the next round. Because today, the truth cracked through marble. Bunyiron, ngoy gyu luat bi, jutra. The moment Judge Alden stepped off the bench, the story stopped being just legal. It became political. And within hours, the Department of Justice confirmed what everyone suspected. An official investigation had been launched into potential judicial misconduct involving Alden and outside influence from the nonprofit organization Justice Horizon. At first, the statement was dry, clinical language, cautious tone, carefully worded. But behind the scenes, the engine was already roaring. Federal investigators submitted emergency subpoenas for digital records, pulling server access logs, archived emails, metadata from court-issued devices, and financial disclosure statements tied to Alden and his former clerks. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Emails between Alden's office and Justice Horizon legal strategists were recovered. Some marked time-sensitive alignment, others early draft feedback. Keep internal. Internal court memos were flagged where key phrases used in Alden's rulings mirrored those submitted by outside advocacy groups, well before any official filing date. And then came the real trigger, financial reports showing that a side foundation affiliated with Justice Horizon had deposited over $75,000 in consulting fees to a political advisory firm operated by Alden's former law clerk. It wasn't just smoke, it was fire, and it was spreading fast. But as the evidence grew, so did the counterattack. The backlash against Jasmine Crockett began with whispers, then sharpened into a campaign. Commentators flooded the airwaves. Pundits who'd once praised her courtroom skill now called her reckless. Headlines pivoted. They didn't say whistleblower, they said agitator. Nighttime talk shows spliced footage of her courtroom confrontation with ominous music, calling her performance a political ambush disguised as justice. A senior senator appeared on cable news and said flatly, "This kind of spectacle undermines public trust in our courts." Political blogs picked up an old student activist clip of Jasmine speaking at a protest 15 years earlier. She was 19, standing on a folding chair, shouting into a megaphone, "Burn it all down if it was never built for us." Taken out of context, it now ran on a loop, painted as her true agenda. On one channel, a commentator said, "She's not trying to save the law, she's trying to dismantle it." The labels came quickly. Radical, firebrand, system breaker, media opportunist. They didn't come for her evidence. They came for her character, for her voice, for the fact that a black woman had stepped into a courtroom and pointed a finger directly at the system itself. Some anchors didn't even try to hide their contempt. "Who does she think she is?" one sneered. "A defense attorney doesn't get to decide what a judge does behind closed doors." The attacks weren't just media-driven. She started receiving anonymous calls. A brick was thrown through the window of the law clinic where she volunteered. Donors threatened to pull funding from civil rights nonprofits that had once supported her. Quiet pressure, strategic silence, coordinated pushback. The message was clear. Stay in your lane. But Jasmine didn't back down. She didn't hide. She didn't wait for a PR firm to handle the storm. 3 nights after the smear campaign peaked, she walked into a primetime broadcast studio, alone, without handlers, without preconditions, and sat across from one of the toughest anchors on television. It wasn't a puff interview. It was an interrogation. But Jasmine was ready. When asked if she regretted blowing up a federal courtroom, she responded with surgical calm. I didn't blow anything up. I revealed what was already broken. The anchor pressed harder. People are saying you're dangerous, that you've compromised judicial neutrality by going public. Jasmine's eyes locked on the camera. Her voice dropped, slow, controlled, unmistakably clear. Justice doesn't exist to protect the reputations of men in robes. It exists to protect people who don't have power, don't have lawyers, don't have cameras watching. And if the truth threatens their comfort, then maybe they were never holding justice, just control. Justice cannot be censored by fear, not in my courtroom, not in this country. The studio went quiet. The control room froze. Seconds later, Twitter lit up like a power grid. Clips of her statement spread across social media, racking up millions of views in hours. Hashtags exploded. Justice, not fear, Crockett. Truth, who judges the judge. Civil rights leaders praised her. Law students quoted her. Even a handful of former federal clerks, quietly and carefully, began signaling support. But Jasmine didn't celebrate. She knew better. This wasn't vindication. This was resistance. What she'd done had triggered something far deeper than headlines. She'd peeled back the curtain on a legal system that many feared to question. She wasn't the only target anymore. The truth was, and once exposed, it doesn't go back into the envelope. It only spreads. And Jasmine? She would rather stand alone in truth than be welcomed in silence. The truth, once set loose, didn't crawl. It ran. Less than 72 hours after Jasmine Crockett's national interview, the Department of Justice issued a second, far more pointed announcement. Judge Richard Alden had been placed on immediate administrative suspension, pending the outcome of the ongoing investigation. This time, the language wasn't careful. It wasn't veiled in diplomacy. It cited credible allegations of ethical violations, improper communications with advocacy organizations, and potential interference with the impartial exercise of federal judicial duties. The order was signed by the Office of the Inspector General, approved by the Chief Circuit Judge, and executed without delay. No ceremony, no warning. Just a knock on the judge's private chamber's door, and 2 U.S. Marshals waiting on the other side. They didn't come in shouting. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was the siren. Alden, still in his robe, had been reviewing a docket for the next week's session. He never got to finish it. The senior marshal read from a folder, voice neutral but sharp. By federal order, your duties are suspended, effective immediately. You are to step away from the bench. All official access is revoked. Please surrender any and all personal devices used in connection with your office. For the first time in decades, Alden didn't speak. He didn't question the order. He didn't bark a legal defense. He simply stared. At the document, at the marshals, at the career slipping through his fingers like sand. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and slowly removed a black phone, a court-issued laptop, and a single external hard drive. One of the marshals stepped forward with a padded evidence case. No one said a word as Alden placed each item inside, the clicks of the clasps echoing like nails into the coffin of his authority. Then came the moment that sealed it, when the younger marshal, barely 30, reached over and removed Alden's access badge from his lapel. It had been clipped there for 20 years. He had walked into hundreds of courtrooms with that badge. Now he would never wear it again. Across the city, news alerts flashed with surgical speed. Breaking. Judge Richard Alden suspended amid DOJ probe. Federal marshals seized judicial devices in Chicago. Sources confirm financial records and private email logs, now in federal custody. Cameras swarmed the federal building within minutes. Helicopters hovered overhead. Protesters gathered by noon, some demanding deeper investigation, others defending the judge they claimed was being sacrificed for politics. But no one really knew what had snapped the system's silence. Jasmine did. From her office, Jasmine watched the live coverage on mute, her eyes focused, her fingers still. She didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no cheering, just a stillness, like standing in the quiet after an explosion, waiting for the smoke to settle and see what's left. Rebecca, seated nearby, broke the silence. "It happened," she said, voice low. Jasmine nodded. "It was supposed to," she replied. "The question is, what happens now?" Because Jasmine knew too well that removing one man from power didn't fix the machine he helped build. Alden was a symbol, but he wasn't alone, and symbols don't fall without a fight. Already, unnamed sources close to the bench were leaking to media, pushing back. Rumors circulated that Alden would mount a vigorous defense. One op-ed referred to the suspension as a dangerous overreach, driven by media hysteria and activist sabotage. They didn't mention Jasmine by name, but everyone knew who they were talking about. She wasn't just the whistleblower's ally now. She was the accelerant. Meanwhile, inside Alden's now vacant office, federal agents worked like surgeons. Cabinets were unlocked, filing systems combed, password-protected folders decrypted by forensic techs. At 3:42 p.m., one agent discovered a private USB drive stored behind a false panel in the bottom drawer. Inside were drafts, documents bearing edits and feedback from outside parties who had no legal standing in the cases they touched. The timeline matched the rulings Jasmine had challenged. The implications were nuclear. Still, outside in the public arena, the narrative war raged. One conservative news anchor opened his segment with, "So a judge made a few calls, looked at a few drafts. That's not corruption, it's consultation. But now a radical lawyer with a camera and a microphone thinks she gets to rewrite the rules." But Jasmine wasn't playing defense. That night she appeared again on live television. This time the background was a plain black curtain, no lights, no glamour, just her voice, just the facts. Judge Alden wore a robe, yes. But what he wrapped in that robe wasn't justice. It was protection, for influence, for deals made in the dark. "I didn't put him on trial. He did that himself the moment he opened the door to people who don't speak in court, but speak in his inbox. And now the system has to decide if it has the courage to finish what it started." By the time she finished speaking, the screen behind her displayed a simple banner: a federal judge suspended, a system exposed. What comes next? And across the country, millions were asking the same thing. The political temperature in Washington had reached a boiling point. The DOJ investigation was still unfolding, but Congress could no longer afford to wait. The evidence was too explosive, the public pressure too fierce, and the system too exposed to keep operating in silence. And so, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, a bipartisan Senate Oversight Committee called for an emergency judicial ethics hearing, public, live-streamed, and nationally broadcast. It wasn't just about Judge Alden anymore. It was about trust, about whether Americans could still walk into a courtroom and believe that justice wasn't already bought, edited, or scheduled. And sitting at the top of the witness list, the name in bold black print, Jasmine Crockett. She arrived without an entourage, without makeup artists or message consultants. No one briefed her at the last minute. She didn't need it. Jasmine walked into the Capitol that morning like she had into the courtroom weeks earlier, measured, composed, and ready to face a machine built to silence people like her. As she stepped through the grand marble rotunda, camera crews followed every movement. Reporters whispered her name, and security flanked the corridor. But none of it fazed her. The corridors of power had tried to discredit her, drown her in noise, and paint her as the problem. But none of it had stuck, because the truth had landed, and now power had no choice but to listen. Inside the Senate hearing room, the mood was taut. The air conditioning hummed beneath the static of tension. Senators from both parties sat in elevated positions, some with notepads in front of them, others with posture stiff as stone. The room was full: law clerks, DOJ representatives, press, even 2 former judges. The chair banged the gavel once. "This committee is now in session. Ms. Crockett, please approach." She stood without hesitation and walked to the center seat at the long witness table. Her oath was short and clean. Her hand didn't shake. She sat down and folded her hands once the microphone lit red. The questioning began as expected, measured, political, and cautiously neutral. Ms. Crockett, can you confirm when you first received the affidavit from Mr. Cameron West? Did you notify law enforcement before going public? What was your intent in confronting Judge Alden during a live proceeding? Jasmine answered directly, never flinching. She wasn't there to be clever. She was there to be clear. But it wasn't until the third round of questions that the moment came. A senior senator leaned forward, fingertips pressed together, voice lower than the others. Ms. Crockett, if you had to say who was most impacted by this scandal, not politically but personally, who would that be? Jasmine paused, and for the first time, the room truly quieted. Not because they were waiting for drama, but because they sensed something real was coming. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. This isn't about me. This isn't about headlines. This is about the people who were never heard. The father who got deported without a hearing because someone edited a ruling before it was filed. The woman who begged for her asylum case to be reopened and got a templated denial that matched a draft sent weeks earlier by a third-party group. The people whose cases weren't just delayed. They were decided before they even arrived. That's who I'm speaking for today. The ones who were judged without ever being seen. The ones this building was supposed to protect. A hush rolled over the chamber. No interruptions, no rebuttals, just silence. Jasmine's voice had filled the room with something rare in congressional hearings. Truth that didn't need to be translated. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't perform. She just spoke, and the system had no option but to listen. The senators shifted in their seats, some visibly affected. One leaned back and exhaled quietly. Even the committee chair took a few seconds before responding. Thank you, Ms. Crockett. That will be entered into the record. She nodded once, stood, and stepped away from the microphone. No applause, no theatrics, just gravity. Outside, the Capitol steps had become a media circus. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, floodlights humming, boom mics overhead. They were all waiting. They expected her to give a statement, to step into the spotlight she had earned. But Jasmine didn't stop. She walked straight down the steps, past the cameras, past the noise, past the temptation to make the moment about herself. Her eyes didn't dart. Her stride didn't break. Flash bulbs went off like machine gun fire, and voices shouted questions rapid fire. But she said nothing, because this wasn't her victory to claim. This wasn't about profile or power. It was about those who had never been allowed inside these halls, never seen the inside of a courtroom that treated them as equals, never been given the dignity of being heard. And as she disappeared into the crowd, no entourage, no announcement, no speech, she left behind not silence, but a space where accountability had finally begun. Not because a system allowed it, but because a single voice refused to be quiet. The fall of Judge Alden sent shockwaves through the legal world, but what came next was even more seismic. With mounting public pressure and evidence too damning to ignore, Congress convened a high-level hearing to address systemic failures in judicial ethics and influence. It wasn't just about Alden anymore. It was about the cracks he'd revealed, cracks that led into courtrooms across the country. And at the center of it all, called to testify not as a lawyer, but as a witness to the truth, was Jasmine Crockett. Her name appeared first on the hearing schedule, above sitting judges, legal scholars, and former DOJ officials. The committee chamber was full. Senators lined the dais, cameras lined the walls, and outside, barricades held back hundreds who'd come to watch history tilt on its axis. Jasmine entered through the East Wing entrance of the Capitol, not flanked by security or aides, but walking alone, her heels tapping the marble floor like a drumbeat. The room quieted when she stepped in. Reporters whispered. A few aides paused mid-note. She didn't wear a bright color or a symbolic pin, just a black suit, sharp and simple. No distractions, only resolve. When she was sworn in, her voice didn't shake. She raised her right hand with the same composure she'd shown in court and took her seat at the witness table without glancing at a single camera. The opening questions came quickly. Do you believe Judge Alden acted with intent? Were you politically motivated? Did you seek media attention? Jasmine answered each one with clarity, never defensive, never evasive. But then came the moment that defined it all. A senator leaned forward, voice quieter than the rest. Ms. Crockett, in your view, who was harmed the most in all of this? Jasmine paused, not for effect, but for weight. Then she spoke. The people who were supposed to be heard, but never were. The immigrant mother deported before her asylum claim was processed. The teenager whose case was dismissed before he even got a lawyer. The families who came to court expecting fairness and found a script already written. That's who I'm here for. I didn't come to speak about myself. I came to speak for the people who were judged before they were even seen. The room went silent, not out of courtesy, but because there was nothing left to say. No grandstanding, no political spin, just truth, heavy and unmoving. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her testimony wasn't loud. It was seismic. And every word landed with the weight of someone who had not just seen injustice, but refused to walk away from it. After 2 hours of questioning, Jasmine stood, thanked the committee, and walked out the way she came. Quiet, unshaken, deliberate. Outside, the Capitol was swallowed in a forest of microphones and floodlights. Reporters surged, shouting her name. Flashes exploded. Questions flew from every angle. But she didn't stop to answer. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't smile. Jasmine simply walked through the chaos with her head held high, her face calm, her eyes forward, like someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to protect. Because for her, it was never about recognition, never about revenge. It was about restoring something that had been taken from people too powerless to get it back on their own. And in that moment, under the harsh lights of a nation watching, Jasmine Crockett walked out of the Capitol not as a headline, but as a reckoning. The echo of Jasmine Crockett's closing statement was still circling headlines when the silence shattered once again. This time not by testimony, but by a leak. It started as a whisper, a quiet tip to a mid-tier legal journalist in D.C. Then came the file, an audio clip. No watermark, no flashy editing, just a conversation, clean and chilling. Within hours, it was confirmed, a voice print-matched, time-stamped, authenticated recording between Judge Richard Alden and a senior legislative counsel from the Senate Judiciary Committee. What followed wasn't speculation. It was a sentence. 9 words that blew the door off everything Jasmine had spent weeks trying to expose. You write the law, I'll back the ruling. The voice was Alden's. Unmistakable. Calm. Almost bored. He spoke like someone who'd made that arrangement more than once. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't a misquote, it was a deal. The exchange took place in a Senate office, off hours, just weeks before Alden's controversial opinion on asylum processing delays. And now, that quiet, smoky deal was public, and the entire legal system had to answer for it. By morning, the nation was on fire. Newsrooms dropped scheduled programming. Radio stations opened lines. Every headline screamed the same thing in different ways. A judge for sale, audio links court to Congress. The sentence that shattered separation of powers. You write the law, leaked recording rocks Supreme Bench. Social media ignited. Hashtags trended for 12 hours straight. Rigged Justice Alden tapes law for hire. Commentators shouted over each other on cable news. Former clerks and retired judges were dragged into emergency interviews. Think tanks issued midnight statements demanding reform. But the most staggering response came from inside the government. At 9:47 a.m., the Speaker of the House issued a rare bipartisan call for a congressional emergency ethics session, effective immediately. Senators scrambled. Staffers were called back from recess. Doors that hadn't opened in a decade swung wide. No one could defend it, not out loud, not even those who had looked the other way for years. Because this time, there was no room for narrative. There was tape. The committee chamber was a standing room only. Senior lawmakers looked like they hadn't slept. Some hadn't. One senator, red-eyed and furious, slammed his palm on the table. A federal judge offering to pre-approve rulings in exchange for political cooperation? We're not talking about corruption anymore. We're talking about conspiracy. Behind the microphone, staffers rushed to prepare exhibits. Transcripts of the recording were already in everyone's hands, highlighted and time-stamped. Jasmine's affidavit from weeks earlier, once considered aggressive, even speculative, was now being reread like prophecy. Everything she said had been dismissed as exaggeration. Now it was a roadmap. Outside the building, the public swelled. Hundreds lined the steps holding handwritten signs. Justice should not be negotiated. This system failed us. She didn't. You write the law, we'll rewrite the system. Reporters shouted updates live from the Capitol lawn. Aerial camera crews hovered above. And somewhere, deep within the Department of Justice, officials moved to freeze all Alden-authored rulings under active review. In the midst of the storm, Jasmine remained silent. She didn't tweet. She didn't grant interviews. She stayed inside her modest office with the blinds drawn, watching the country confront what she had seen all along. Her phone buzzed with messages from senators, attorneys, strangers, but she ignored most of them. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew the storm wasn't the end. It was the start of something much harder. Because buried under the fury, beneath the headlines and hashtags, was the deeper truth. A judge had bartered justice in exchange for legislation. And worse, he had done it comfortably, like a man who believed the system wouldn't care, because maybe it never had. Jasmine didn't need to say it. The tape said it for her, loud, clear, and irreversible. It came like a wave, not of applause or recognition, but of calculated sabotage. Jasmine Crockett had survived the courtroom, the committee chamber, and the firestorm of public scrutiny. But power, when threatened, doesn't retreat, it retaliates. And it came quietly at first. A login attempt here, an unknown IP address there. Then in the span of 72 hours, the full weight of the backlash revealed itself. Her personal email was hacked. Her law firm's internal server crashed. Private messages were leaked, some real, some doctored. Anonymous accounts began pushing a narrative that Jasmine had manipulated evidence, coerced a federal clerk, even accepted money from advocacy groups. It was fiction, but it didn't need to be true. It just needed to sound close enough. Then came the bombshell. A formal complaint filed with the State Bar Association alleging professional misconduct, citing ethical violations during federal proceedings, and demanding a temporary suspension of her license. It was signed by a former DOJ official, a name the public trusted, but one Jasmine and Rebecca knew had direct ties to Alden's former clerks. The complaint was slick, dressed in legal language and manufactured outrage. It cited timestamps, client interactions, courtroom transcripts, every detail carefully cherry-picked, reworded, reassembled into a weapon. And it worked. The media pounced. Networks that had praised her 3 weeks earlier now ran with the headline, "Was Jasmine Crockett the hero or just another player?" News anchors spoke about due process while subtly implying guilt. Blogs posted grainy screenshots implying conflicts of interest. Legal panels debated her future, her past, her motives. Some asked if she'd crossed a line. Others didn't bother with questions. They declared her finished. Inside her office, Jasmine watched it unfold with the same cold stillness she had worn in the courtroom. But behind her eyes, it burned. Not because they doubted her, but because they knew this wasn't about her. It was about sending a message. Don't come this far again. Don't make us bleed again, or we will make you disappear. But what the machine didn't count on was Rebecca. Rebecca Lulton had built her career inside the very system now trying to crush her partner. A former federal prosecutor with scars to prove it, she knew exactly how these things were constructed. Fake timelines, credentialed names, selective outrage, and misdirection. She didn't flinch. She went to work. First, she subpoenaed the IP logs from the complaint's submission portal. Then she ran server forensics on the leaked documents. She cross-referenced the witness testimony cited in the complaint with security badge data from the courthouse. One by one, the holes widened. The complaint had been submitted from a network connected to a lobbying firm once retained by Justice Horizon. The leaked messages originated from an account registered to a burner device, bought in cash 2 weeks prior, 1 block from Alden's former clerk's office. But the final nail came when Rebecca uncovered a digital trail, a set of internal emails, mistakenly sent to a defunct Justice Horizon alias, outlining the plan to reposition the narrative, and undermine public faith in Crockett's legal standing. She didn't wait. She filed a counter motion. She demanded a hearing. The ethics committee convened in a sterile, high-ceiling conference room. No cameras, no press, just legal minds in the war for one woman's name. Jasmine stood silent as Rebecca laid out the case, each piece methodically placed like chess moves. Screens lit up with side-by-side comparisons, file names, IP data, source locations. A clear, orchestrated attempt to assassinate Jasmine's credibility from inside the system. When Rebecca finished, the room didn't clap, but it didn't blink either. The chair of the panel looked down at the fabricated complaint, then up at Jasmine. His words were slow, heavy. This board finds no basis for the charges presented. This case is dismissed. This complaint should never have reached this room. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just exhaled. Once. Slowly. But she wasn't done. She rose from her seat and asked respectfully for the opportunity to say something for the record. They allowed it. And Jasmine stepped to the front of the room, just as she had in the Senate, just as she had in the courtroom. But this time, the target wasn't one man. It was the idea that truth could be punished into silence. Her voice was low, not angry, controlled, resonant. I didn't come here today to clear my name. I came because this is the cost of exposing what we're not supposed to see. I've been called a liar, a radical, a threat to the system. But what does it say about that system when exposing the truth becomes the real crime? What does it say when a judge makes deals in secret and the one who calls it out is the one put on trial? I've been followed, hacked, threatened, and targeted, not because I broke the law, but because I broke the silence. She paused, let the weight of it settle. Justice, she said, eyes locked on the panel, is never free, and sometimes it has to be bought with sacrifice. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. She gathered her things, nodded to Rebecca, and walked out of the hearing room without applause, without cameras, without ceremony. But in the streets outside, in living rooms, in courtrooms, in quiet corners of America, people were listening, people were watching, and now finally people were asking the right question. What kind of system punishes those who try to fix it? And thanks to Jasmine, they were no longer afraid to demand the answer. 12 months had passed since the walls cracked. The country was no longer the same. The facade of an untouchable judiciary had been pierced, and it bled in public. 7 judges were formally removed from the bench in the largest judicial purge in modern U.S. history. 4 more faced federal indictments, their names etched into court filings once reserved for the people they used to rule over. The trials had not yet begun, but the damage was already done. America had seen what lived behind the curtain, and it couldn't unsee it. But while most headlines screamed about scandal and collapse, something quieter had taken root. Reform. The newly formed United States Judicial Reform Commission had been voted into existence by a rare bipartisan effort, its charter forged not from tradition, but necessity. The system needed fixing, and the public demanded someone they could trust to stand near its reconstruction without being consumed by it. There was only one name that made sense: Jasmine Crockett. She refused the title of chair. She didn't want power, but she agreed to serve as honorary legal advisor, overseeing ethical reforms, community outreach, and the early blueprints for a new federal code of transparency. Her involvement was discreet, deliberate. She didn't attend every meeting. She didn't sit for press interviews. She didn't want to become the face of a movement that belonged to millions. She turned down all political offers, Senate, House, even talks of a cabinet seat. She was invited onto talk shows, profiled by magazines, offered book deals. She declined them all, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but because she understood something most didn't. When the fight is this personal, the stage is the last place you belong. So she left the spotlight, and she built something instead. On the south side of Chicago, inside a renovated red brick post office, she opened the Colonial Law Institute, a legal empowerment center for immigrants, low-income families, and marginalized communities who had never had the tools to fight back. No marble floors, no polished glass, just desks, open doors, and real people. The sign out front didn't carry her name, just a bronze plaque with one line, "Where the law learns to listen." Volunteers came in waves. Law students from across the country asked to clerk there. Former public defenders donated hours. Mothers brought their children just to see what courage looked like in human form. But Jasmine never made speeches. She taught workshops, mentored one-on-one, and reviewed case files late into the night. She had faced down a system and survived, but now she chose to stand beside those still inside it. And then one day something happened that reminded her why she had fought in the first place. It was late afternoon when a boy, maybe 12 years old, pushed open the front door of the institute. He wore a second-hand backpack, scuffed sneakers, and eyes that had already seen more than they should have. Jasmine looked up from a folder as he stepped in, hesitant but determined. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask about programs or paperwork. He just stood in front of her and asked, "Can you teach me how to stand up?" The words hit harder than any ruling, any headline, any gavel strike. She didn't speak right away. She closed the folder gently, leaned forward, and looked him in the eye. Not like an adult addressing a child, but like a fighter recognizing another. Then she said, "You don't need anyone to give you permission to be right. You just need to never apologize for it. Standing up doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment you refuse to sit down when the world tells you to. So yes, I can teach you how to fight. But first, you need to believe that you deserve to." The boy nodded slowly, like someone receiving armor piece by piece. Jasmine smiled. She stood, walked to the shelf behind her, and handed him a small paperback copy of the Constitution. "Start with this," she said, "not because it gives you power, but because it reminds you you've always had it." Outside, the sun dipped behind the roofline of the old building. Inside, the room was quiet. It wasn't the kind of ending that made news. There were no cameras, no applause, no breaking headlines. But for Jasmine Crockett, this was the victory. Not the courtroom, not the hearing, not the headlines, but a single child stepping into a place that had once been denied to voices like his and asking not for permission, but for guidance. Because she had always known, justice doesn't end when the gavel falls. It begins when the next hand reaches for it. Thought for 4 seconds, and in the quiet aftermath of all that storm and fury, a stark realization settled over every shattered corridor and smoke-filled hearing room. Justice is not something gifted from on high, doled out by black-robed arbiters to those they deem worthy. It does not descend in polite decrees or ceremonial gavels, handed down from pedestals like charity to the occasional lucky few. Instead, justice lives in the tremor of a single voice raised in protest, in the steady footfall of someone who refuses to kneel when the world demands it. Jasmine Crockett's life had become a testament to that truth. She had torn through layers of silence and indifference, not by waiting politely for permission, but by unflinchingly stepping into the breach. Every insult hurled at her, every threat to her safety, every attempt to erase her from the record only fanned the flames of her resolve. She learned, sometimes in bruised flesh and sleepless nights, that the law, when left to its own devices, can become a cage instead of a shield. But people with courage carved from necessity, could bend it back toward its promise. In Jasmine's fight, a simple maxim emerged. You don't need permission to do what's right. You just need the will to stand. At first, that lesson was whispered in hallways and small community centers. The single mother whose eviction notice was reversed after Jasmine demanded a hearing. The immigrant families who finally felt seen because she refused to let a deportation flight take off on silence. The teenager who received bail only after Jasmine refused to back down. Each victory was a blow against the idea that courts were impregnable fortresses. But real justice wasn't measured by case-by-case wins alone. It was the ripple effect that followed. Every person who watched Jasmine stand alone felt a tremor beneath their feet, a message coursing through neighborhoods where too many had believed their voices didn't matter. And when those whispers spread into roars, the system trembled. It was never the law itself that saved the day. It was the people wielding it against tyranny, unafraid of the cost. Jasmine became the emblem of that movement, not because she wore a badge, but because she refused to yield. The machinery of power convulsed at the idea that one woman's defiance could fracture centuries of unchallenged authority. They scrubbed transcripts, rewrote emails, whispered in chambers. But the truth, like a river carving through rock, found a way. It poured into courtrooms that once rang with hollow words and reverberated into the streets where children learned that justice doesn't arrive on time unless someone calls it forward. In every battered window, in every midnight vigil, in every quiet prayer offered before dawn, Jasmine's message bloomed. You don't need a permit to protest a wrong. It was as simple as raising a folder of documents and as profound as refusing to leave an empty courtroom. The law cracked open because she demanded that it could. And when it did, people saw what real power looked like. Not the bench, not the gavel, but the will of individuals. Justice does not wear a label, nor does it patrol the halls in search of the oppressed. It waits in the hearts of those who choose not to look away. Jasmine learned that every time she pressed her foot against a courthouse step, every time she met another pair of fearful eyes with unflinching assurance, she was forging justice from thin air. It wasn't a matter of legal precedent. It was spiritual conviction. In the courtroom, she exposed the rot. Outside it, she nurtured the seeds of defiance. She taught that a single affidavit could topple walls, but a movement required thousands of hands. When the judiciary's highest citadels trembled, it wasn't because laws changed. It was because people remembered their own strength. And the boy clutching his tattered constitution at her institute learned that he too could stand tall, unbidden. Transitioning from that institutional battlefield to the battered neighborhoods she served, Jasmine built sanctuaries of empowerment. The Colonial Law Institute, not grand or gilded, but warm with human presence, became ground zero for reclaiming dignity. There, justice learned to speak in plain language, to meet eyes instead of towering over heads. Jasmine refused invitations to power's higher echelons because she knew that platform would distance her from the people who needed her most. She chose classrooms over committees, one-on-one mentoring over televised debates, and in those moments the core truth revealed itself again. Justice thrives when it is shared, not bestowed. The Institute's walls echoed with testimony from the unheard, and Jasmine's simple creed bounced back at every turn. You don't need permission to stand up for what you believe is right. In the swirl of aftermath, when headlines dimmed and political winds shifted, the people Jasmine touched carried her message onward. Across living rooms and lunch counters, her words circulated like gospel. We don't need a royal decree to demand fairness. It was no longer her fight alone. It was theirs. They carried petition forms. They organized community meetings. They confronted bureaucrats armed with unwavering conviction. And the justice system, once thought unshakable, knowed itself vulnerable. Because it was no longer a monolith. It was a living thing, susceptible to the pressure of human will. Courts that once refused hearings now hurried to comply. Judges once unchallenged now paused at the bench. All because bodies and voices had broken the illusion of silence. Yet even as Jasmine's legend grew, she remained painfully aware of the cost. She had scars others couldn't see. Late nights replaying objections in her mind. Mornings waking to the question, did she do enough? Threats still lingered at the edge of her day, and she knew better than most that the system's retaliation could be ruthless. But that knowledge didn't deter her. It fueled her. It reminded her that every sitting official, every silent onlooker, had a moment of choice, to stand or to stand aside. And when they stood, they didn't need a rubber stamp from power. They needed courage. Jasmine became both the spark and the forge, shaping new advocates from raw determination. The final threads of her story were woven not in the glare of media cameras, but in small moments. The single mother who taught her daughter that the law could be wielded for love, not just punishment. The factory worker who walked into a union meeting and didn't look away when injustice was named. The teenager who found his voice in Jasmine's workshops and used it to reclaim his father's custody hearing. Each thread strengthened the fabric of justice, proving that it wasn't a trickle from above, but a tide swelling from human resolve. And in every face lit by newfound hope, Jasmine found proof that her simple message was more than rhetoric. We don't need permission to do what's right. In the end, the most powerful courtroom confrontation was not the one before judges and juries, but the one inside the hearts of ordinary people deciding to act. Jasmine Crockett had wielded her own courage against a system built to resist, and in doing so, she reminded a nation of something essential, that justice is neither a monument nor a mandate. It is a movement. It is not maintained by statutes alone, but by souls who refuse to bow. And if a single woman could stand unflinching in a storm of power and corruption, then any one of us could too. Because the door to justice isn't locked by protocol. It's held open by the steady hand that refuses to be silenced. And in that refusal lies the greatest truth of all. We don't need permission to do what's right. Thought for a couple of seconds. Now it's your turn to step into the breach that Jasmine Crockett opened, because justice won't wait for permission, and neither can we. Stand up today. Call your representatives at dawn's first light and demand that every court be held to the highest standard of transparency and accountability. Share Jasmine's story on every social feed you control, from the smallest group chat to the widest broadcast, until the echo of one woman's courage becomes a chorus of millions. Volunteer your voice and your time at local legal aid clinics, where the system still leaves too many standing alone in the dark. Donate to community centers fighting for fair hearings and unbiased counsel, because every dollar you spare is another lifeline for someone silenced by silence. Organize a city hall vigil or a peaceful rally in front of your local courthouse. Let the sound of your boots on the pavement rattle the foundations of complacency. Write op-eds, letters to the editor, and heartfelt messages that refuse to let this moment slip into oblivion. Mentor a young person, maybe that 12-year-old with big questions, in your neighborhood, teaching them that courage doesn't require invitation. And above all, refuse to sit quietly while injustice is dressed in legalese and paraded as procedure. Demand fairness, speak truth, and claim your right to do what's right. The fight isn't over, not until every courtroom, every judge, and every lawmaker knows that the people will not be silenced, and that we don't need anyone's blessing to demand justice. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.